Welcome to Edinburgh Napier University. Just a couple of quick formalities before we start. Washrooms are back there, just as you come out the door, just turn left. No fire alarms, so back out the way you came in. We're on the ground floor, so that should be nice and easy. I'm duty bound to tell you about our MSc programme, our very flexible programme aimed at people who are working. So we do MSCs, executive MSCs for cybercrime, strategic ICT leadership, data science, and of course, project and program management. Who put that there? So anyway, that's pretty much it. Enough for me. If anybody wants to talk more about the MSCs, there's plenty of brochures, and I'll be available to chat and discuss as well. So I'll hand you over to Sath, who will introduce our guest speaker. Sath will be much more entertaining. Okay.
Thank you very much. There we go. Good. Hi. Welcome to you all. I'm Sath. I'm one of your co-hosts tonight for our event. So this is part of the Future Work in Scotland meetup. I'm delighted to have Peter here tonight. So Preetham's done most of the formality bits. I don't do any of those. A couple of other quick things. Like any other meetup, we obviously have a code of conduct. I think you all understand how this sorts of things work. Just, be nice to each other, be respectful. If you don't know it, you can find it and read it, but I think everybody gets the general idea. I think other than that, so I'm delighted to be introducing Peter tonight because I have read the book. And it's fab, so if you've not read it, I would recommend you read it. So Peter is a management consultant working internationally on intent-based leadership implementations. Did I get that right? Okay, and hopefully he's going to explain to us what that means, because I don't know what that means. So Peter's been working closely with David Marquette, who's the author of the book. And so tonight we'll be learning about the book and the themes in the book, which focus a lot on a leadership model. So that's what we're here for, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to it. I'll hand you over to Peter.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. This is a return for me because I think probably about 10 years ago we used these rooms as part of a network that I was managing in my previous role. My previous role for 15 long years, was to be Chief Executive of Investors in People in Scotland. And as part of that organisation, we ran some excellent networks, obviously with the cooperation and great support of Napier at that time. So I'm back on home territory. I left that job as chief executive a little bit over a year ago. And actually, this is the first time that I've spoken back on home soil since then. So my job largely is to work with organisations on a global basis, supporting them to help them implement intent-based leadership. So I'm going to cover a number of different things tonight. But essentially, I guess my proposition is that intent-based leadership challenges some of our assumptions about what leadership is and who leaders are. And I'm going to put that into the context of the challenges that we see organisations facing. We'll spend a little bit of time on that. This is the only joke that I'll link I'm going to make to a submarine all night. But essentially, through the periscope of looking into the next 40 minutes, this is what I'm aiming to cover. We're going to talk about some of the basic principles, the origins of this approach. I'm going to hopefully give you some practices and tools to use, so it's not just simply me telling you a story and the theory. I want to give you some things that you can actually take away and use if you wish to. In the middle of the floor here, we have an interactive tool that we're going to use called the Ladder of Leadership. And you can choose how to be interactive with it. So if you wish to remain in the background when we get into that session, that's absolutely fine. We've also got live streaming, which hopefully is going to pick up our Ladder of Leadership. And I'm also going to talk about the issue of psychological safety, which for those of you who have read Turn the Ship Around, you might go into the index and say, where do I find the psychological safety bit in Turn the Ship Around? There is some reference, but there's not a lot. So what I'm going to talk about is our experience of implementing intent-based leadership and why psychological safety, we believe now, is the absolute foundation before you can do anything else. So can I just take a quick mini survey here, because I'm interested in terms of who knows what coming into this session. I have been on occasion in sessions where I know that people know more about the book than I know about the book. I was working with a big oil company last week, and there was a guy from Texas, and he had literally read Turn the Ship Around 9 times. And so I was like, oh, no. And he was like, what about in chapter 2? Okay, so here's a show of hands, where 5 represents, I have read Turn the Ship Around. In fact, I am implementing some of the practices of intent-based leadership in my organization. That will be 5, where a fist equaling 0 means who, what am I, why am, in fact, I might even be in the wrong room at this point. I've never heard of intent-based leadership, and anything between 1 and 4 is, yeah, I might have got some knowledge, I might have watched a couple of things online, I might even have signed up to our regular weekly nudge. So could you just give me a quick show of hands? Remember, there is no right or wrong answer here. Okay. I'm glad that everybody's holding their fingers a certain way around. That's really helpful. Okay, so there is a range of experience here. Now, I think we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the session, which is I think that's fine. I did a presentation not on intent-based leadership at my local primary school last year. I was doing it on the subject of Africa, where I'd done some work a few years ago. And I stood up and said, right, kids, ask any question you want as you go along. And the teacher's going, no, that's the crazy idea. And they literally asked 100 questions. And I got about this far into what I'd intended to speak. The most difficult question of which was, what's faster, a mouse or an elephant? And I didn't have the answer to that. So I felt useless, and they thought I was useless. So I'm going to take you back maybe 5 years ago, less than a mile away maybe from here. And as the Chief Executive of Investors and People Scotland, I'm sitting in a boardroom. And in front of us is our own Investors and People report. So if you don't know what Investors and People was, our job was to identify and set standards of good practice and then review organizations and accredit them. So we're sitting there reading our report, and it's kind of, you're doing some good stuff, but we're not necessarily seeing the difference that you might want. And I found myself asking this question: how do we get our teams to think like us? And there was all sorts of things which was wrong with that question, which I now recognize. But the fundamental problem was this. There we were as a small group, and this, by the way, is not a cartoon representation of that very group. I am not quite as good looking as the gentleman at the end. But there we were, probably 4 or 5 of us, thinking about, yeah, what more can we do, and why can't we get them to think like us? And the very problem was present in the room. Or it wasn't in the room, in the sense that we were dividing ourselves into the people who were leading the organization from those who were the followers. And everything that I had known about leadership and leadership development up until that point was the job of a leader is to inspire and motivate people to achieve a goal. And leadership development is all about making people better at inspiring. But that model was based on this fundamental assumption. Some people lead and some people follow. And that wasn't working for us. And it wasn't working for us for a number of reasons. And some of these are present here. And I'm just going to summarize what I now see within different organizations. I'm going to move very quickly over the issue of technology because I think that's just there with us ever present. And I want to focus on 4 other things. The first is how smartphones have completely changed the relationship between organizations and their customers. Our customers and consumers now have much more choice, and they have a much louder voice. So think about, for those of you who are that old, 15, 20 years ago, if we wanted to go on holiday, unless you're a bit of a travel buff and got a rough guide and booked things independently, you'd go to a travel agent, they'd give you a brochure, and they'd tell you this is the finest hotel in a beautiful location with wonderful food, and you turn up and maybe the hotel hadn't been finished and it's next to the motorway, there's no water in the swimming pool, and the food is disgusting. And the only people that we can complain to at that point is the travel rep. And we might write a letter when we get back, and we get a letter back saying, we're very sorry, here's another £200 towards your holiday with us next year. So at that point, and in that era, those organizations and those travel companies had complete control. The smartphone has changed that. So if we imagine that rigid, structured, hierarchical organizations in which only a certain number of people at the top of an organization make the decisions is going to be fit for purpose, we challenge that. The second is this sense of how do we compete, and if we're not competing on price, we're going to compete on the value of our ideas. And does that mean to say, well, we just rely on everything which comes out of a research and development function, or do we rely on the insight and the experience that people see who are actually doing the work? My observation is that over the course of the last 20, 25 years, I can probably tie it in politically almost, that organizations have become swallowed up by management by process at the cost of leadership by judgment. And then finally, the importance of people being able to say what they think and leaders understanding what people can see. Marquet said, whoa, what's going on here? So he comes back up the line and he says to his second in command, did you know there was no 2/3 on this boat? Yes, sir. And he said, well, why did you order it? He said, well, I just thought you knew better. At which point, he literally said, oh my God, I think we are all going to die because I am issuing commands about a boat that I don't understand, and you're following those commands through. So they stopped at that, and he vowed that he would never give another order, and instead the crew would tell him what they were intending to do. And from that came the story of Turn the Ship Around. Now, at the heart of that challenge was this, what we call our no-tell axis. So up this axis is the level of knowledge that somebody has. And across here is the level to which they tell or direct people towards tasks. So a traditional leader is somebody probably who you find up here. High level of knowledge and a high level of preference to tell people what to do. Here, this is a nightmare situation. This is the leader who has a strong preference to tell people what to do, but not much understanding of what's really going on. The most well-known example that we've looked at recently was following the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, where the Japanese Prime Minister took overall control of the response to the crisis. He was a micromanager who loved to get into the detail, and he had no prior knowledge of how to deal with the fallout from a nuclear reactor. Marquet found himself effectively in this position, where he didn't have a high level of knowledge about the submarine, and so he decided not to tell people what to do. Over time, he made it his job, of course, to learn the submarine so that he could evaluate the decisions that people were making and he could support their development. We will come back to this, but as a simple diagnostic tool in terms of thinking about where do we think our leaders need to be. And when I think about leaders, it's people throughout the organization, anybody who has responsibility for anyone else. There are some interesting questions and assumptions that we can make. We'll come back to that and conclude with that. So, David wrote the book. He got some astonishing endorsements, including from Stephen Covey, who spent 5 days on the submarine. And Covey said, I thought I knew about empowerment until I saw this. This is completely different. So essentially, the way in which David has captured it is to say, look, this is about looking at the people and practices of an organization and separating it out from the personality of the leader. So what I'm going to talk about a lot is practices. I'm going to talk also about language, but what we won't talk about is the type of personality that makes somebody a good intent-based leader. So there are 6 principles. I thought in terms of how best to structure this, and so what I've decided to do is to base it around the 6 principles that we have developed, which capture intent-based leadership. I will refer to some of the mechanisms that you will see through the book. For some reason that is slightly historical, you'll know that it's a principle because it will start spinning. I was doing this with another group where I was asking them, I was testing their knowledge. So I'm going to work through each of the principles and explain a little bit about what they mean in practice. This first one, I think probably, and I should say that, I didn't say up front, David gets asked to speak to agile audiences probably more than anybody agile management and leadership roles a lot. Civil service would be a starting point. I'm sorry if I've offended anybody from the civil service. I've seen that in the English civil service, not the Scottish civil service, obviously. So the 3 C's is a starting point in terms of how we give control. I then want to talk about the ladder of leadership. So David created this with Stephen Covey when Covey visited the submarine. And if you wish to, you can either watch on here or you can stand up and see what I'm going to be a bit interactive and walk up and down here for a couple of minutes. I'm going to use a quick prompt. So the idea here is that traditionally, when organizations say, well, we want to empower our people, they don't necessarily do it with a particularly structured plan. And so leaders here, well, you need to do more in terms of empowering your people. And people here, oh, well, there's a new thing. We're going to be empowered. And it goes something like this. This is the challenge that we see. So this ladder starts down here at level 1. So level 1 is what we see as the traditional approach to leadership, where the preference of the leader is to tell people what to do. But equally what we know is that you can easily do. What you'll hear is they'll say, well, I'll come along, I'm here between 9 and 5, I'll work really hard, but you make the decisions. That's what you're here to do. So when organizations set out in terms of trying to empower people, what we see is this. They move too quickly from somewhere down towards the bottom of the ladder, right up here. And what you'll notice is in terms of what's important, and then going through the process in terms of thinking what are the options that we've got here before finally saying, this is what I intend to do. Now, what do you think the difference might be between level 4, which is, this is what I'd like to do, and level 5, which is, this is what I intend to do? Right, good. Yeah. Who said permission? You threw your voice very nicely. So essentially, that's right. I would like to do something, but that doesn't mean to say that I'm going to do it. At this point, I'm intending to do it. And what has happened is that as we move up this ladder, the psychological ownership has shifted. So here at this point, as the line manager, I'm owning all of the decisions, right? I'm telling you what to do. Line manager has got to always have the back of their team member. Otherwise, there's no way in which somebody's going to say, well, this is what I'm intending to do. If they say, yeah, I'm going to do it, and then you're going to hang out to dry. Right? So this is the structure that we work with when we deploy in organizations. And I want to just give you a couple of examples of how we take people up this ladder. I'm not going to do that level of detail, but let me share a little bit more. So to be really clear, that the sweet spot that we're aiming for is level 5. And the clue is like in the title, intent-based leadership, I intend to. It's what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to do. At that point, the great thing for the leader, the team leader, is they can still intervene if it's a crazy idea. So I was working with a business in Baltimore recently, and they'd say, yeah, we've been practicing this, but here's an example. Somebody came to me and said, oh, yeah, well, I'm about to buy this piece of technical equipment for the laboratory. How much is it going to cost? $20,000. Whoa! No. The budget's only $5,000. So if you then use this ladder to analyze what has gone wrong, somewhere down here, in terms of the sharing of information, what do you see? The line manager has not said, by the way, the budget in this area is $5,000. So it's important to emphasize that you can move up and down this ladder whilst still aiming to get people ultimately up to the top. So 5 is our sweet spot. It creates the psychological ownership. It creates a safe environment. So let me just talk you through a couple of other things as we go up and why this is important. When we look at this picture, we do this as an exercise, which I'm not going to do. We don't have the time to do it, but I will illustrate it by saying, if I asked you, what do you see in this picture? No one will say the same thing. So what we're trying to do at level 5 on our ladder, oh, and by the way, if we just, would you mind just distributing those? That would be really helpful. One per person, yep. What we're doing at level 2 on this ladder is checking in, what do we see? Because what you see might be different from what I see. So there's a checking process, and the benefit is we're sharing information. As we move up the ladder, and I will share these slides afterwards, what we're trying to do is to slow down or make a more effective decision-making process. So we observe organizations who move very quickly through the decision-making process of, this is what I see, this is what I think, this is what I'm going to do. And traditionally, the line manager may be the person who does all of that thinking. So here's an example from a big food manufacturer we're working with. The line manager traditionally might say, well, we're behind on the schedule, the solution is this, going to shift people in, the action is move 2 people across. If you're using something like the ladder, the question is, what's happening to cause this delay? So I'm already inviting perspective. How could we resolve the problem? Let's take this option. So essentially, we're just slowing the decision-making process down to get better decisions and ultimately to stop problems occurring next time round. As we move up this ladder, what becomes absolutely essential is the language and particularly the questions that leaders can use in terms of encouraging thinking. So let's just do this exercise really quickly. I'd like you to look at those 7 questions, and just to rank the 7 statements, and just to rank them in order of how far you think that they encourage thinking in somebody in a team. So just take a minute in terms of that. So, I promised this would be interactive. So, who would like to give an example? Which of these statements do you think might come low down in terms of encouraging somebody's thinking? Yes, sir. Oh, we have 2. Sorry, 2.
Well, you said my door is always open. I'd say, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. Tell me more about that.
So it's in terms of the thinking around it, you're forcing someone to bring you solutions. It means you've already closed your thinking loop. You're not actually forecasting forward or encouraging interaction.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, what if you don't have a solution? So what are you going to do? Make something up? And so I was working with a company last week in Indiana, and the chief executive did a video and used this. It's very difficult to then contradict on. But but you're spot on. Yeah, we want people to think through what the answer might be, but not on a, effectively gun to the head, you've got to do this. Okay, and so what was did you mention? Let's go for somebody else. Which other statement do you not think would encourage thinking?
My door is always open.
Right. And for years and years, I sat in my office with investors and people, and the first thing I said when people joined the company, please remember my door is always open, you can come and ask me about anything. And I thought that was great because I was always providing the answers. And I think there's a real challenge in terms of changing the identity that we have as leaders and managers, because we want to help, we want to be the person who's there. That's what we do. And we've also got lots of knowledge and lots of experience, and so we're slightly flattered when people go, what do you think I should do about this? Well, this is what I think we should do. But every time we do that, we stop a bit of it. I remember talking to a colleague who returned into a police division in Scotland a couple of years ago, and he'd been in the corporate team for a couple of years, went back in as an operational, quite senior, chief superintendent level, and said, what was the biggest thing that you noticed? That every morning I had a queue of other senior people, inspectors, chief inspectors, outside my office, come in, give me a 5-minute brief. What do you think I should do, boss? Really? And he said every time, or 90% of the time, they had the answer for themselves. But there was an expectation, I'll go and talk to the boss about this. Okay, let's flip it. What statements do you like that would encourage thinking? Puneet?
Number 2.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
So that's kind of you're laying out the vision. That here's the goal, here's you want to get to. So I would like your opinion. What do you think you're going to do? How do we get there?
Yeah, I think so.
How do they think for themselves and have an opinion?
So those of you who've read the Turnership around book might recognise this as being specify the goal rather than the method to get there. So yeah, good. What else do people like in terms of, or don't or dislike in terms of any of these statements?
I don't know. What do you think? I think it's encouraging.
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know is a great thing for anybody to use in terms of development, even when they do know. Sometimes it's good to know. Yeah. Okay, and
I think like number 4 is nice as well because it gives them ownership in sort of the future of what's happening.
Yeah.
And they are able to really shape
yeah.
what's happening in the organization and ultimately determine. You know?
Yeah, and you're putting it into that context of what do we want in 6 months' time? There's no real right or wrong answers with these, although you've kind of spotted the ones which are slightly troublesome. So we think that language is absolutely fundamental in enabling somebody to be able to develop and move up to that level 5. And then the final aspect of this, I think, is the most difficult of all. So we will send round a link to an animation which tells the story of David Marquet and the Santa Fe, and some of you may have seen it. So this is a snapshot from it. And what's happening here is that the crew member has come to the captain and said, Captain, I intend to submerge the ship. And the captain says, what do you think I'm thinking? And the crew member says, is it safe? Right. Okay, so what notifies whether it's safe? There's nobody left on the board, everything's shut, the right level of water is there, etc., etc. So we've used this and thought about, well, how does that apply in other organizations? And how do you use guiding principles for decision making? So we talk about this in terms of making the invisible visible. So if I'm going to be expected to start saying this is what I intend to do, so I am in effect stepping up and making decisions that previously my line manager might have made, the line manager's job is to share their experience and what goes on in their head when they make decisions. So talking through what we call talk out loud, share your experience, share why you're making this decision. Because if people don't understand and don't have this sense of criteria of what informs a good decision or a bad decision, then ultimately they will struggle to take on responsibility. So we bracket it, and we've used this across a number of different organisations. What does safe mean? What's a safe decision for the organisation? So that might be literally health and safety perspective. It might be about what's safe financially. It might be about what's safe legally. And what's the right thing to do? Well, that might be what's the right thing to do for the customer or the people in the organisation or in line with the values. But let me give you, I'm going to use another driving comparison because sometimes when people think about leadership development, they might use a word like role model. So I like observing X because they're a real role model. That's interesting. If you then draw a comparison in terms of if I was learning to drive, if I was trying to learn to drive, and for the first 2 months, all I was able to do was to sit in the passenger seat and observe a driver driving. I would see what they do, but unless they explain to me everything that they are thinking as they make their decisions, my development is restricted. So we think it's fine to work with the principle of role models, but role models have got to talk through their thinking. Otherwise, I can only see what you do, not necessarily why you do it. So that takes us through the ladder of leadership. And this takes me back to the grid that I used earlier on. So effectively what we're saying is that you use the ladder to move across the know to tell axis. Okay. I'm going to jump over that because just from a time perspective, I want to spend a little bit of time on this issue. So if this is the structure for giving up control and passing over responsibility, where does psychological safety come in? So our view is that right from the start point, as soon as you ask somebody, well, tell me, what do you see? Or tell me, what do you think? Or what would you like to do? If they don't feel safe, they're unlikely to tell you what they really think or what they really see. And, oh, there we go. What three words link these three words? What one word follows all three of these words? Right. So what our experience is that under pressure, or when being asked questions for the first time, people might do one of three things. We make things up. So we don't know what to answer, so we fill that vacuum with something which feels as if it's kind of, yes, well, we're making good progress on it. I'm not going to tell you anything specific at this point, but I'm just broadly kind of treading a very fine line with the truth, but I'm not actually giving you any valid information. I was highly practiced at this myself. In the face of a difficult question, well, I don't want to tell you the truth, which is, do you know what, I don't know, so I'm just going to make something up. Yeah, we've had some very interesting discussions with a number of organisations about that, and we'll get you some information in the next week or so. So, or we find the cover-up, which is, there's nothing to worry about here, everything's under control, staying quiet when we know something's going wrong. So our onus here is about getting people to say what they think and see without fear. The cycle that we're interested in challenging is one that if I feel worried about speaking up, or indeed to talking about things which have gone wrong, then effectively we'll never learn, and we end up in a position where everybody assumes that somebody else is going to talk about it. So this is where we want to get to. Psychological safety, a comfort of admitting mistakes and learning, which will drive better decision-making. It goes back to that achieving excellence or avoiding errors. One of the biggest case studies that we have studied in the last 2 years is from a ship called the El Faro, which very few people in the UK know about. But it was one of the biggest maritime accidents in the last 30 years. Sailing between Florida and Puerto Rico, completely routine voyage that it did every week. It sank and 33 sailors died. And it sank because it sailed into the middle of a hurricane, which was a crazy, crazy thing to do. And what happened was that the captain effectively disappeared to his quarters for the critical period in which the boat was sailing towards the hurricane. The crew called the captain 2 or 3 times, said, we think we should change course. And the captain said, no, just carry on. So the reason that we've paid particular attention to it is that, similar to an aeroplane, the ship had a black box. In fact, it's the only thing that was really been recovered. Nothing else was. So our team have been through 500 pages of the transcript of what happened on this boat in the 3 days leading up to its sinking. If you looked at it in our normal, go back to that traditional sense of what an organisation looks like and who leaders are, you wouldn't spot anything which was untoward. Captain didn't bully anybody, he didn't use any bad language. But what he did do was to ask a number of interesting questions. Well, interesting once we look at them. So he made over 1,200 statements on the voyage, which included 165 questions. This is a sample of the type of questions that he asked. Do you know what I'm saying? What would you call this? Is it between these two? Everything good as far as speed goes? Does that make sense? So what do we notice about the questions? Yeah, they're a mixture of closed responses or affirming what the captain thinks in the first instance. And what they're not doing is really giving anybody the opportunity to respond in a meaningful way or to challenge him. So it's binary, answering his own question, giving a binary choice, or binary based on what's important to the question. And this final one was the really stark one for me, because for many years I had used this expression. I signed off emails with it. I concluded discussions in team meetings. I would do it in a one-to-one. And I thought I was doing the right thing because I was checking somebody's understanding. Does this make sense? Does that make sense? But what if somebody interprets that question as being, are you capable of operating at the same intellectual or level of experience as I do? And what am I going to say? Does that make sense? A, it's a binary question. But B, well, if it doesn't make sense, what does that potentially reveal about my own capability? So we've used the El Faro as a kind of testing ground in terms of looking at how you could adjust language and how the captain, if he'd asked different questions, would have achieved, well, he'd still be here today. For those of you more interested in that, David's new book comes out in February, which is called The Language of Leadership, and the El Faro case study is the main object of that focus. So within that, one of the things that we're interested in is the power gradient that exists within teams and within organizations. So the power gradient might be represented by symbolic representations, which tell people some people are more important in this organization than others. I went to a client somewhere in England last year. It was a perfect example. So I walked up to the front door. There's a parking space for the chairman and the chief executive next to the front door. Walked in. I was working in the suite where the chief executive and the directors operated. You couldn't get in there without a special pass. When we walked in, there were lots of pictures all the way around this suite of pictures of the chief executive. And all the messages were, this guy's really, really important. And everything I heard about people's perception in this business was, yeah, it all goes back to Trevor. Trevor, not his real name. Trevor does this. Trevor, this is an organization with 2,000 people. So the power gradient there is really, really steep. So one of the things that we look at is what do we see when teams work together? And there's the physical representations, but also what happens when a team works together. So if you're having a normal meeting, does everybody look at the most senior person in the room when they're speaking? Does the most senior person in the room set the agenda, start each item and conclude each item? Do people wait until they've heard what the most senior person has said before they offer their own opinion? So these are all symbols. Now, what we think is that you want something which is, that there has to be a gradient. Okay? So we don't believe that a completely flat team or flat organization is necessarily going to work. You would equate that to a stagnant pond. Things might not happen. But equally, you don't want a waterfall situation where it's just plunging down from the top. So the power gradient will influence levels of psychological safety. And here, to conclude, a couple of other examples where organizations think that they've got it right, but they might not. So everybody, I'm sure, will know the story of the original space shuttle disaster and the fact that there was people who spoke up but were not listened to. NASA spent loads of money in terms of developing their culture, try and create openness, and yet disaster happens again. So here are a couple of quotes from two of the senior leaders involved in the 2003 disaster. And they're saying, we had a really, really open culture. People knew that they should speak up. Well, this was an email which was drafted but never sent by one of the lead engineers. And in effect, what he's saying is, if you go ahead with the plan to bring the shuttle back down to Earth without carrying out further investigation, we are dealing with a potential fatal situation. Look at this. It says, remember, the safety posters everywhere. If it's not safe, say so. It's that serious. He drafted it, but he never sent it. And the investigation into the inquiry uncovered this. And when he was asked, he said, well, he'd already raised the matter, but he would then defer to management's judgment in terms of whether they should go through and obtain more imagery. And the most telling bit for me of this was when the mission head was then asked the question, how do you seek out dissenting opinions? She says, yeah, well, when I hear them, obviously, or when somebody comes forward and tells me. And then the question goes back, what techniques did you use to seek it out? Nothing. So this is the difference between somebody who believes that they've got a safe environment, because we've got a great team, everybody works together, and a leader who actively goes out and seeks different and dissenting opinion. The way in which we do this, we think that there are a number of different techniques. I've talked about the importance of language and the importance of questions, but we use a number of different models. We think there is a link between the sensitivity of the issue and the importance of the issue. So sensitivity might be about, is this sensitive to somebody's own individual needs or the way in which a team works together? The importance might be in terms of where does this sit from a strategic perspective. The more important, the more sensitive it is, the more you've got to give people the opportunity to contribute anonymously without their views being then attributed to them. You can also then say, well, let's move beyond anonymous, and you can use cards. So let me just illustrate a couple of points here. How would you use anonymous? There are a whole range of good polling apps that you can now use, which are free unless you're doing it across 200 people. I was working with a big science organisation who now regularly, ahead of a project management review, will send around an anonymous questionnaire saying, where do you believe we are in terms of progress towards project? Do you feel your contribution is being maximised, etc., etc. All questions that you would want in a project review, but with a group of people sitting around under pressure will not necessarily answer completely truthfully. The cards that we use could be as simple as post-it notes, or we have these probability cards in which you have a range of numbers, and so you ask a question, well, what do you think the probability of the project being delivered on time? And you choose a number, you lay it on the table before you've had any discussion at all, so you're taking any bias out of it, and then everybody turns their card up at the same time. People are not influenced by other people, so our objective here is not consensus, it's the truth of what do people really think. I'll give you an example from post-it notes. I was working with a company in the States where the chief executive introduced a new 3-year strategy to effectively a new leadership team. And at the end of it, he said, right, so I want to know who's bought into the strategy then. Who's bought in? And he actually tried to deploy this approach, which is okay, but it's for very simple, non-controversial issues, which is the simple fist of 5, which probably most people will know. And he tried to do a fist of 5 on how far are you bought into my strategy. So we just stopped it. Let's have a look at it in a different way. Everybody just wrote a number on a post-it note, put it in the middle of the table, completely unattributable. So at the end of that meeting, what the CEO knew was that about 70% of his team were aligned to and supportive of the way forward or had clarity on the way forward, but he had some work to do with 30%. So he's just got a whole load of data that he previously wouldn't have had. And everybody knows, who recognises this gentleman? Leeson, Nick Leeson. So some colleagues of mine were doing some work with Nick Leeson recently. He's now turned his career around into being a risk advisor on risk. But it's a brilliant, brilliant example. There was a Radio 4, Evan Davis's Bottom Line. He interviewed Nick Leeson and talked about this. So this is what he said. It all started with a mistake. I made a mistake. I didn't really want to speak up and say what had happened because I didn't feel I was able to. And what I learned from that mistake was I can cover it up. So I'm going to take a bigger gamble next time, and a bigger gamble, and a bigger gamble. If Barings had had a culture in which people felt, you make a mistake, you speak up, we would argue that none of the rest would have happened. So, finally, one of the things that I would encourage you to do, if you're interested in what I've said, is that we have a weekly leadership nudge, which is like a 2-minute little insight, normally from David, occasionally from me, or other more interesting people. Here is a recent example from Colombia.
Hi, I'm on a coffee plantation in Medellin, Colombia, at an altitude of about 6,000 feet. And here's a coffee plant. You can see the beans, and they're red, which means they're ready for picking. Now, the farmer has done the right job putting the plant with the right slope, the right sun and shade combination, and the right amount of water, and the plant grew. If the plant didn't grow, the farmer couldn't stand on the side of the field and just yell at the plant. It wouldn't grow. And yet that's what I sometimes see bosses do. They haven't created the right environment for their people, but they're just going to compensate by maybe just yelling at them. It makes no sense. It has the same impact, which is zero, actually negative. So as leaders, what we want to do is the same thing the farmer does. Create the right environment for our people to grow, and they'll just grow naturally. Leaders fix the environment, not people. I'm David Marquet. That's your leadership nudge.
So that's our penultimate principle. We fix the environment first before we fix the people. I'll give you an example from another police force in England where the introduction of new technology had an unintended consequence. So the new radios were so good that the constables and officers on the street started checking into the station before they made a decision. Because they could. They were passing the responsibility back. Somebody else is going to make this decision. So they spotted this is an organisation, a force that was starting to use intent-based leadership. They spotted it and they introduced a simple mechanism, which was don't lean in. So don't lean in was don't lean back into the radio and respond when somebody asks you permission. Now, if it was a life or death situation, they would respond, but they chose not to respond. They would choose not to respond for 30 seconds or a minute because they knew that in that time, the officer on the street would need to make the decision. But it was the environment that had created that situation more than anything else. So what you can see here is a whole range of things, some of which we've talked about today, which all contribute towards creating the environment that allow it to flourish. So let me go back to our no-tell axis. And we use this quite a lot when we work with organizations. Because the assumption is that there are always times when you need to have a leader operating in this box here. Now, that might well be the case, but in each of these examples that we've presented here, our proposition is that an organization that is operating with intent, where people have clarity and competence on their role, who are able to make decisions, particularly in an emergency situation, are going to be better equipped to respond to their environment than somebody and a team that relies exclusively or largely on a leader to make those decisions. When you think about a number of those situations might be interpreted as being emergencies, the question is this: who's the emergency for? So when I was in the back of, about 18 months ago, not too far away, going around the bypass in an ambulance with my dad, who'd had a stroke, he was having an emergency. Paramedic was not having an emergency. The paramedic was doing his job. So we think that in most cases, teams should be able to operate in this right-hand corner. Not all of the time, you move up and down the ladder. But what we do and what we look at is to say, in most of the cases that you can see there, the organisation of the team would be better placed operating in this quadrant. We can talk about that after if you think I'm wrong. And hey, I'm just here to present some propositions. There's no right or wrongs. So what do we think is different about this compared to other approaches? And what I would say is that some of the stuff that Ala talked about will not be new to you. It might be presented in a different way. Some of the things that we look at is it's about developing the whole organisation, not just people at the top. We've talked about psychological safety. I will talk about the importance of changing action rather than beliefs. The focus on power and language, that we're creating emancipated people rather than simply empowering people. You're pushing the decision as close to the customer as possible, and fundamentally it changes the role of leaders from being directors to developers. So we bring this all together in the 6 principles, 5 of which I've talked about so far, and they come together in this idea that we get better by tuning control and competence and pushing authority to information, but we can only do that if people feel safe and leaders create the type of environment that people are able to flourish in. And so finally, to conclude, how do we do this? This is an unusual proposition. This is an unusual gig for me in terms of I've stood up and largely spoken. The share of voice in this room is 95% me. Fundamentally, we believe that people act their way to new thinking rather than think their way to new action. What that means is don't spend time in a room trying to change people's beliefs, but give them practices to use and to go and experiment with. Because it's only when people see things and see how they might work is that they might then begin to change and they begin to change their minds. We can't change people's beliefs. We can't change their experience. We can only give them things that might help them change in the workplace. And the example I would give, my simple personal example, for years and years I was terrified of flying. My dad was an air traffic controller, which was a bit worrying that I was so scared of flying. He's more scared of flying than I am. Right, that really worries me. So I was terrified of flying, didn't fly till my 20s, and then I needed to start, I had to fly for work. I was based in London, I had to fly up here or to Belfast. I had a great boss. She held my hand on every flight. And she actually held my hand. She did, yeah. Yeah, she was great. She was a brilliant boss in many ways, and that was one of the reasons. And now I fly every week, I would say, probably. In fact, I found myself sitting on a transatlantic flight a couple of months ago, reading a book about air crashes. And I was like, oh, okay, I've jumped the shark now. But that hasn't happened because somebody has told me repeatedly, it's safe, it's safe. It hasn't happened because I've been hypnotized or indeed read lots of books. It's practice. I've just got used to it and I've seen it. I've seen it for myself. Every time I say this, then I think the next flight. Yeah. So this act your way to new thinking is based on the idea of it's only practice that will change the way in which we work. So some of the things that I've shared with you tonight, maybe you could start practicing with the 3 C's as a planning tool, as a diagnostic tool. You can take away the ladder and maybe use that in the next conversation that you're having, or think about the type of interactions that you have with your teams or your colleagues. And this, I think, can work irrespective of whether you have a position which is formally deemed as line manager or not. If you're influencing anybody else in a team, this stuff comes into play. If you want to find out more, here is where you can go to our international site, to me, or we have a local partner in Edinburgh. Curiously, I was previously the chief executive of that organisation. It's the rebranded Investors and People organisation. And I'm going to finish with one final proposition for you. This is about practicing giving up control, and it's really simple. So what we experience when we work with organisations is the thing that people feel most uncomfortable with is, well, what do you mean as a line man? I'm giving up control, I'm giving up... So here's a way of practicing it. Next time you go out to dinner or lunch or wherever you're going somewhere where somebody's supplying something, get somebody else to choose. Preferably, get the chef to choose. Maybe the server, maybe the waiter or waitress, but I reckon the chef. And I'll finish with a story from Scotland which illustrates this beautifully. And we were talking about Dunblane earlier on. So I live in Dunblane. There's a very popular Indian restaurant in Dunblane, the India Gate. We don't particularly like the food there. So when we get a takeaway on a Friday night, little guy comes on his motorbike all the way from Stirling, passes the India Gate up our road. So last summer I was out with some friends, we've been playing golf, had a long day, and somebody said, let's go to the India Gate. I wasn't going to push back on that. And as we sat down, somebody not me, said, let's get the chef to choose. Oh, okay. So the waiter came over. We want the chef to choose. Really? Yeah, we have a mix of meat, fish, vegetarian, spicy, mild, etc. Well, bear in mind, this was a restaurant that I really didn't rate the food in, but that's because I chose the food. So imagine what happens when the chef hears, got 4 guys out there, they want you to choose the food. It was unbelievable. It was the best Indian food that I'd ever had. I would never have chosen it. But of course, who had the expertise in that restaurant about Indian food? Not me. I'm just go straight in, oh yeah, I'll have a pasanda. That's what I like. We pushed authority to where the information was, and we got an outstanding result. I would encourage you to try and do the same thing. See what the results are. So I've probably gone over a little bit, Donald, in terms of time, but I'm happy to take the questions that may come up, not any questions. Yes, sir.
I've been reading a little bit about the breakdown in leadership in Boeing. And one of the things that's coming up is they're almost saying that they've inherited the culture from a company they took over, McDonnell Douglas.
Yeah.
And sort of separating out the leadership, moving them to Chicago. What's the parity with what you're talking about here in terms of that's where they've actually separated the leadership from the business itself?
Yeah, so one of the things that we talk about is you separate out the decision maker from the decision evaluator. And what happens, I think, when things go wrong is those 2 roles go together. So somebody will make the decision and no one else can evaluate whether that's a good decision or not. I don't know enough in terms of what the merger of McDonnell Douglas and Boeing in that situation to be able to tell you more about that.
Because they say, I mean, in terms of it's people analysing the company from outside, so
Yeah.
it's the likes of the FT and the Atlantic and things sort of giving their perspective and why the 737 MAX has been such a...
Right. But so my understanding in terms of what's happened with Boeing, what happened with VW is it's the pressure that comes down from the top in terms of we have to deliver, we have to deliver, we have to deliver. And nobody or people then feeling unable to say, actually, if we continue down that path, this is the potential consequence. So I think there are 2 aspects to that. One is the people speak up, but secondly, more importantly, senior leaders, David talks about this in terms of we're not interested in harmony, we're interested in the truth. So the job of the leader is to uncover exactly what the position is, not what they want to do. Yes?
Fascinating presentation, Peter. I think I know why you talked a lot of agile groups. I think it's because agile and your no-tell axis for a common goal is to move it to the right. And I've certainly seen many examples where organisations, say bottom-up implementation, things only go so far. And it's exactly as David said in the video, is the environment doesn't change.
Yeah.
So how can we facilitate the change in the environment to encourage this kind of shift to the right?
So what happens, I think, with a lot of change is that it is forced, it's top down. But the mistake, I think, is it goes layer by layer by layer, rather than straight down the organisation. So what we've seen when we've worked with organisations is rather than trying to change a whole executive team, you take one function, but you work with everybody in that function. Right? So from the most senior person through to the person right in the front line, potentially I could be dealing with the customer or working on the production line. And you're involving them all in the development process, rather than relying on just doing change for one person at the top. And what comes out there in particular is 2 things. Generally organisations seem to be better at understanding competence and defining competence than they do in terms of defining clarity. And so when you go through the strata of an organisation, what we tend to hear is 2 things. Firstly, the message gets very lost as you go through. And what that sounds like is that people will hear this. Bob needs this by Monday morning. So we ultimately become a provider to Bob, rather than the reason that we need this is this, this, and this. This is what this is. So the why is often missing in that clarity piece. And then secondly is that control factor, which is somebody has set some form of arbitrary target, which is then pushed through the organisation, and ultimately at the front line, I don't have control of my ability to be able to deliver. So we think that the way in which you create change is by working entirely through that structure, rather than do work with these guys and they'll cascade it through.
Do you think it's something that can be implemented through organisational structures and processes, or is it something that actually has to come from within the individual and more from an individual development point of view?
That's a really good question. I think it is both. What we tend to do is we do a bit of individual development, but more organisation and teams. And our observation is that they start using things like this. They get really familiar with clarity, competence, and control, and then somebody says something like, "I've just had my performance review, and that doesn't work at all." And so you then get into how do we need to start adjusting our processes and approaches.
Okay.
One thing I also would add to that is, when I talked about this idea of red work and blue work. So what we notice is, if you're interested, an exercise to do is to go and have a look at the job descriptions of people that you work with, or your own job description, and classify it according to whether this is red work or blue work. So and the way to determine it is the red work is about doing, executing stuff. And by the way, red work is not bad work. Red work is really, really important. And the blue work is the decisions that I need to make along the way. And from our experience so far, it's remarkable how often a job description, even for more senior people, does not reflect that blue aspect in terms of the importance of the thinking and the decision making. What I think an organisation that is mature with this approach, you would see a blend of red and blue work throughout somebody's job description. Probably inevitably more blue as you get through to the top strata of the organisation. But one of the things that we talk about and we see is that if the leaders get their heads, they might think we might say, well, the blue work tends to sit at the top of the organisation. That doesn't mean to say the leaders do all of the blue work. What we also observe is they get involved in the detail, and they, rather than standing on their toes and saying, well, what are we seeing around us, and what are we seeing in 5 years' time? Because they get buried in making all the decisions, they don't have the ability to see the big picture. And David describes this in a submarine context, that because he stepped back from making the decisions and didn't need to issue the orders, he suddenly was able to see everything that was going on in a way which he wouldn't if he was constantly saying, yep, do that, yep, do that, yep, you can do that. Or so that's for the leader, I think, is the value of stepping back and being able to see the big picture is really important.
Just on that, what happens when you experience the flip side? You're already seeing the big picture, and when you push the decision down, would you not miss out some of the details and understanding?
Yeah, so that's a really important point.
How to compensate?
Yeah. So we will, and I'm using we here because we're really interested in the language that people use. So sometimes we'll hear something like this: I don't need to know what my team's doing. They just get on and do it. And that person thinks, because they might be thinking, I'm presenting myself as the leader who doesn't get involved in micromanaging, the reverse of micromanaging, I leave them to get on with it. We're a bit nervous about that, because how do you then evaluate the decisions that people make? How do you support their development? So if you go back to this model here, we're saying, yeah, you need, ideally we're up here, that you do have a reasonably high level of knowledge about what's happening in the team. It's just that you stop people telling what to do. If you're down here, I'm not sure how effective you can be in terms of supporting the development of the team and overall evaluating whether or not the organisation is going to be successful. I'm interested in terms of things like, well, so does the CEO of British Airways need to be a pilot? I'm not sure. Does the head of Boeing need to be an engineer? I would say yeah, because I think that's where you begin to fall into a trap if somebody doesn't have the appropriate level of knowledge and understanding of what their business or their team is about. The BA one, I'm not sure. You could go either way. The problem with them being a pilot is that it's reinforcing that BA is a transport company that has the inconvenience of flying people around.
It's interesting you use that example though, because obviously that almost backfired because you had an engineer in charge of BP when they had the Deepwater Horizon.
Right.
And he took an engineering perspective to what was actually a PR problem.
Okay, so there's two different aspects to that. There's what actually happened on the well in the first instance, and there's some really interesting stuff there. Have you seen the film?
I have, yeah.
So we're talking about the Deepwater Horizon disaster. We've looked again at one of the transcripts there, where an engineer literally was standing next to a button or a lever which would seal the top of the well
I remember
and
that,
stop the flames, right? And they didn't do it for 8 minutes because they needed permission from the offshore installation manager. So there's this extraordinary situation. Death, process. Death, process. And in the end, they were just do it. You've just got to do it. So I know more about that than that's an interesting thing in terms of the engineer managing the process wasn't necessarily.
Yeah.
A lot of those structures you talked about within an organisation.
Yeah.
Have you come across any examples where that structure has been across parts of organisations, working towards a common goal? Sort of initiate that culture change in there?
No, I'm going to be honest with you. So what we tend to do is to work in bits, in parts of organisations, and then they build towards doing something altogether. So I'm not going to make something up. But I'm happy to talk about this in terms of what we're interested in.
Might have time for one more, maybe?
So, have you seen the leadership policies that sort of measure for success? Have you seen any strategies to move other things like word mapping, specialized strategies to shift culture in direction?
So what you've seen from me is a really, really abbreviated version of what we might spend a week working with our client on. And what we try to do is to say, well, this is how we move somebody from level 1 to level 2. This is how we go from level 3 to level 4. One of the points I didn't make, which is vital, is you can only ever invite somebody up the ladder. You cannot force them up the ladder. So it's what do you think? What do you see? And sometimes somebody will say, I've been trying this with one of my team members, just can't get them up beyond level 2. What do I do? You just keep going at level 2. That's fine. And maybe after a few months they'll get so used to the fact that you're asking them, what do you see? They'll start saying, well, before you ask me, this is what I'm seeing. So invitation only. But yeah, there are specific strategies to take people up through each level to the ladder. Run of the ladder.
Great. Fab. Thank you. I really liked your little example there of where you might actually try to push the decision making to where the information was. I have to try that extra amount for dinner. A couple of other quick announcements just to wrap up. I forgot to thank our kind sponsors, Cohesive, for the pizza and the beer. That's Fraser Nickelback, he's the head of business development. Give us a wave, Fraser. So if you want to chat to Fraser about what Cohesive do, grab him at the end. Thanks again to Pritam for hosting us tonight. And industry announcements. So just the Agile Scotland.
Does anybody want to share anything with the group?
We're always happy to push out announcements for people if you've got other interesting meetups coming up, or you're part of other groups and you want to tell everybody about it. More than happy for you to stick your hand up and say a couple of words. You're probably all aware of the Agile Scotland Leads got one, haven't you?
There's an event up tomorrow. It's for the innovation ecosystem, the startup awards. So if you haven't checked it out, it's on Jam House. So that'd be quite a fun place if you're at the tech world.
Okay, great. And Agile Scotland, most of you will know, is on the 6th of December. So I think there's still some tickets. Rob might know.
Yeah, I believe so. And I think there's also
code for 50% off.
March event.
Is it for the March event?
Till
I don't know part of it.
Till Friday.
Silly.
That's right, so we can get some discounts now for the one in March. Okay, so it's definitely information online about that, but yeah, just keen that we get those messages out for our colleagues in the other groups. Yeah, once again, just thanks to Peter, I think, for a fab presentation on Maybe 8 QA, so thank you all for participating. Well, we've still got 5 minutes for people to
Just
chat.
over half an hour, there's plenty
Yeah.
for the night.
Just want to network a little bit on where we are.
Do a wee bit of
Safe
networking.
journey home.
Thanks to the Project 4 guys as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.